Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. A very warm welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar on minimising project risk, and in particular through the use of data analytics and artificial intelligence. Today's webinar is in partnership with Faithful+Gould, a global construction consultancy. My name is Alan Muse. I'm Global Head of Building and Construction Standards at the RICS. And today we're discussing some of the tools and techniques for minimising risk on construction projects. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at how the main players in the industry deal with risk and the new solutions that data and technology can offer in this area. And I'm really pleased to say that we have a very knowledgeable panel with us today to discuss these issues. And therefore, may I introduce them to you? Firstly, we have Jeff Oakson, Director of Consult Services at Faithful+Gould in North America. Hello, Jeff.
Hello, Alan.
Thank you. Secondly, Jerry Nagara, Lead Project Manager at Faithful+Gould in North America. Hello, Jerry.
Hello, Alan.
And finally, Donna Huey, Director of Client Technology at Atkins, the parent company in North America. Hello, Donna.
Hello, Alan.
And so we have a real blend of people involved in technology and real-world project management in front of us today. And that blend of that profession technology interface is really the key issue in dealing with risk properly, effectively, and productively and efficiently on construction projects today. Now, we always welcome your active involvement, and so do please submit questions to our panel, as it really helps to bring the conversation to life, and I'll be looking out for those as we go through this conversation. And if you are new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and so we'll pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. So first of all, turning to Jeff. Jeff, how well is risk managed in the construction industry, would you say?
Well, before I start, Alan, I'd like to say thanks to you and the RICS team for having us here today, and thanks to everybody who's taken time out of their busy day to listen to us and listen to us chat about risk in general and technology. So really appreciate that. So how well is it managed in the construction industry? So really, it depends on which part of the industry I think that we're going to be talking about, right? In some areas, it's done really well. Like over here in the U.S., a lot of federal and state agencies perform risk management very well. It's part of their fund. It could be part of their funding and delivery requirements. A lot of state agencies have worked with in the recent and distant past, particularly one. Washington State Department of Transportation has a very, very good risk management process and procedure that they take all of their projects through. Very, very mature. It really, the other industries though, it ranges from good to basically non-existent, right? And that's due to a number of different things. It could be owner requirements or lack of owner requirements. It could be a lack of internal requirements. The perception of value. From a contractor's point of view, it could be a cost that makes or breaks a competitive bid, that type of thing. So really, in overall, it really depends on the industry you're looking at as far as how well it's managed. I mean, in general, for those that do it, it's a pretty tried and tested and time-tested and proven, formula on how to identify risks, assess them, model them, mitigate them, and use them as a proper project management tool. But those are for the ones that actually take the time to do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. I wanted to just expand a little bit on what you've said there, because I think it's well known that the scale and complexity of construction schemes continues to increase, and time and cost pressures in terms of procurement are always with us in construction, and low cost, unfortunately, often takes precedence in terms of analysing tender returns. So what about risk in connection with those commercial? Do you feel that is particularly well managed in the industry at present?
So when it comes to those types of things, in terms of more, if I'm understanding you correctly, because you did kind of break up there for a second, Alan, it's really more looking at more global type items that are being affected or managed from a risk item. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but are you mentioning like material availability or any kind of like political upheaval, that type of thing?
Well, I was wondering about, sorry if I broke up, Jeff, but I was wondering about the scale and complexity of construction increasing and how that's affecting the management of risk.
Jeff,
I
if
think
I
it's really,
might offer a quick comment on that. I think one of the things we're seeing as scale and complexity increases, and really appropriate for today's topic, is some of the tried and true kind of gut reactions we have around risk and are shifting. We can't, there's the complexity is getting beyond, dare I say, like normal human brain power. So the ability to use data and analytics, as we're talking about more deeply as we go through today's session, I think we're seeing that shift. We're seeing that shift from the construction industry going to that, gut feel, that tried and true experience, to a more data-driven approach, just so complex scenarios can be analyzed more thoroughly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, also what we're seeing too is just the awareness of good, proper risk management processes embedded into a lot of things. There's really an increasing need for that type of stuff, especially as things become more complex and more globalized in nature. And if we're looking at the increasing value of construction in general, across North America in the next 10 years, there is going to be a need for more and better ways to identify, manage, and mitigate risks, and ideally through the use of data.
That's great, Jeff, and thank you, Donna, for bringing in that technology angle as we'll explore in more detail. And Jerry, I just wondered, from a project management point of view, what's the project management take on this in terms of how well risk is managed in the construction industry at present, from if you like, a practitioner in the industry?
Yeah, so the construction industry is, very heavily exposed to risk, and construction companies really have to deal with internal risks such as cost overruns, schedule delays, job site safety, safety risks, lack of skilled labor, which is becoming a bigger issue, and also, unfamiliar contracting language. And then, you have, external risks, which, could include like supply chain uncertainties. We all know what happened with COVID. We've all experienced the repercussions of COVID and, how COVID has affected our supply chains. And, we have, the environmental risks, market risks, political risks, as well as regulatory risks. And then, to quantify risks, the construction companies, use various methods to, and I'll quickly go through, three common, if I want to say common, methods used. You have your rule of thumb, that Donna kind of alluded to, the gut feel, the high level method of quantifying risk, which really relies on the human element of someone's expertise, or past experience to identify how much, for example, contingency is required to mitigate risks, right? So, and then you have, qualitative analysis, which I think is mostly used in the construction industry by way of risk registers, and then you have, your quantitative analysis, which basically attributes values, to risk. So, for example, there's a 10% probability of a risk happening, and if that risk actually happens, it'll be like a $5 million repercussion. So again, an example of that is, use of Monte Carlo simulations. So in terms of the effectiveness of these methods, I think it varies. These methods tend to rely a lot on the human element to identify and manage risks. And to be honest, they are really only as good as whether those risks are identified in the first place and how well the resources are, are assigned to manage those risks actually understand risk management. So that's quite a challenge, So, and as an example, the use of risk registers is all well and good, but it only works if the risks, are identified, and new risks. Risks are identified, those and continue to be monitored. So, these methods can only be effective if the human element has a really good, I would say, a good grasp on risk management, which includes, identifying the risk, evaluating the risk, scoring the risk, and really treating that risk.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. That's very interesting. And actually, just as an adjunct to that, I wanted to bring Jeff in here because there is an issue, isn't there, about in current risk registers in the construction industry, taking them as a little bit of a tick sheet exercise rather than turning them into definitive action. What's your take on actually bringing risk to the fore more in the industry, Jeff? Have you got any views on that?
Yeah, actually, I do. I mean, it has, in my mind, it has a lot to do with changing the culture and the attitude around risk management in general, right? In all parts of all industries, right? And really, largely, that's going to be an owner-driven type of endeavor, right? Because it's a costly thing to do, right? If it's done properly, right? We all know this or suspect it, but the benefits of it far outweigh the cost. But unfortunately, a lot of times things like the proper risk workshops and the consistent updating of risk registers and constant updating of models as a project progresses gets thrown by the wayside or not done at all, or not even considered because it's not always seen as value add, or it's something that's interfering with the progress of the project. So and again, really depends on the industry that we're talking about here, but overall, overarching, I think it's more of a general attitude towards risk management and getting the culture around that in the construction industry to change to embrace it a bit more, embrace the benefits of doing it.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. And there's also this issue that surrounds risk in the industry of actual project risk is one thing, but there's obviously the wider risks, and I suppose the pandemic's an example of these, the black swan events, if you like, which pervade any industry, but there's not much that can be done about those, or can something be done about them in terms of a management sense? I mean, generally speaking, in your experience, Jerry, are we looking at project risks here, or are we looking at wider risks in terms of the construction process if it's a very large construction project, for example?
I think you have to look at both the internal risks as well as the wider the external risks. A good example was when the pandemic that happened that really crawled our supply chain. Another example is the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and which made ship all the stuff that was supposed to have gone through, all the raw materials, were delayed. And I'm pretty sure, there were quite a few projects that were, impacted by this. So you have to take an external and, internal as well as an external look at what the risks are and continue to monitor them.
And do you think you can do something about the external risks, or do you think that's how do you manage those, I suppose, is my question, Jerry?
In some cases, you could, take on the risk yourself, or defer the risk, through insurance, and just insure yourself against such those types of risks. Because to be honest, no one anticipated the pandemic 2 years ago. No one anticipated, the ship getting stuck at the Suez Canal. So it's just really understanding which risks you can take on head on, and you have, you can be accountable for, and those risks that you cannot manage, and you defer them to a different entity, through, for example, insurance.
Sure. Okay, let's turn to a slightly different aspect now, and turning to Donna in terms of the technology angle. I mean, construction, Donna, is obviously data rich. What are the challenges in getting quality data to help calculate and reduce risk, in your view?
I love this question. It's, I think, a very familiar phrase, data rich, information poor, right? We've heard that in industry for a while. We often within our organization speak of data as becoming more and more our new currency in this industry. It's really at the center of decision making. However, we see data through the life cycle of an infrastructure project still being very fractured. Some of you may be familiar with ISO 19650. This is the new global standard for managing information for the life cycle of the built asset It's the evolution of BS 1192, and really is what the industry and certainly in the design space is leaning on to create a common language around the delivery process, and the increasing adoption of that we hope will cascade through the phases of the project and into construction management. There needs to be a willingness to partner. The maximum efficiency gains that we can have through data standardization are really at that point of interface. And just a great example, literally, in a recent engagement, we were excited about, the evolution we're making in information management in the design side of the equation, meeting with our delivery partner and asking them what kinds of, what do they need, to support their model? What can we pass along? How can we build value from inception? And the answer was, we really would just like to get a PDF. So I mean, we have strides to make. The largest fracture in getting quality data is to close the gaps, to break down those silos, and be able to build value, as I said, from inception. One other aspect is also where the owner of that ultimate asset enters the equation. Good information management needs to begin and end with the asset owner. And the more we can do to increase the education of our asset owners and help them take on ownership of the data and quality data is going to be a huge step forward for all of the delivery partners that follow through in the supply chain.
Well, that's great, Donna. Thank you. And just again a quick follow-up, if I may. I mean, what's your views on data sharing in the industry? There's obviously some blockers and barriers to data sharing, but do you think, for example, that professional institutions ought to get more involved in promoting data sharing, or indeed governments?
That's another really great question. I think the one thing that we still struggle with in that point of interface is intellectual property around data, and feeling like what we give up may become someone else's competitive advantage. And this is this is a cultural struggle. Jeff mentioned industry culture previously, and needing to really break through that. And breaking through that doesn't just mean sitting down at the table holding hands and talking about how we connect and share files better. It also has commercial implications, and we need to deal with that aspect too. So I think that you're right in terms of other organizations getting involved and invested to potentially help with improving the quality of data sharing agreements, licensing of data, usage of data, and having the right protections around that, so that we continue to chip away at those hard edges and get the efficiency gains that the overall industry is really striving for.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. I mean, you mentioned standardization, and clearly analysis goes with that standardization in terms of the use of data and turning it into information, if you like. But turning to Jeff now, I just wondered, Jeff, in your opinion, how is big data analytics and artificial intelligence being used in the construction industry to address the risk at the moment? Because there's a lot of rhetoric and talk about this, and some leading exponents are certainly using it. But what's your view across the industry generally?
Yeah, so I can only speak for what I'm witnessing currently, right? And I'm seeing pockets of it, right? One company may be doing something related to big data collection and using that to inform a risk model, or another one might have using a more automated Monte Carlo type technique to run models, but I don't see anything consistent across the board, right? So one one of the things that we would like to set out to do is actually study this in a greater level of detail. And because I mean, obviously, building off of everything that Donna has said, I mean, there's huge value in it if we can get past a lot of these barriers, right? So, I mean, let's say, take weather data, for example. There's a humongous amount of data that's been collected by the government, from hurricane models up and down the eastern seaboard and within the Gulf Coast. And so we're collecting all that stuff together. And with that data, we can project out the likelihood, and we're using this for petrochemical projects. We can project out the likelihood that of a hurricane hitting that particular site according to longitude, latitude. At a certain time of the year, there's an X% likelihood that a hurricane is going to happen based on 100 years of data that's been collected. So that's a really good example of how that data, which is common and it's out there in the world, can be collected together and used, used collectively for the good of the construction industry as a whole. Right, so that's just one example of how a good one would work, right? But in terms of it being largely used, honestly, I'm not seeing a ton of it, right, out there in the industry. Just like, again, from my limited viewpoint, but I think the again, having access, and maybe that's where we start by maybe taking some of the publicly available information, and along with developing common data standards and having a community of practice, if you will, that's regulated by RICS or some other firm to be able to kind of help drive us in a consistent approach towards this. We could all move on to start that journey, if you will, to piece by piece pull all this stuff together so it helps inform risk models and helps inform better project data.
Jeff, if I might add to your comment on the use of weather data, I think you talked about it from maybe a longer term forecasting, using these models. But the other place where we're also seeing the use of big data analytics in construction is using weather data and patterns and trends with incidents in a real-time basis. So while we're, on an active job site, we can look at, the weather forecast. We can run predictions around incidents based upon trends with those weather patterns and prior incidents. And we can either then use that knowledge to mitigate and avoid having that, safety situation on the job site or in the maintenance of traffic, or we can potentially advance additional personnel to help ensure, safety is secured in those situations where we might not have, an alternative, strategy we can play out and just have to deal, with the cards dealt. So there's some really interesting things happening here too with live sensed data and having big data and analytics help us leverage trends and offer those predictions based upon patterns.
Yeah, that's really, really, really interesting, Donna. But clearly, you need data to do that, to do the patterns and patterns. So I guess that as well. But how do you think it plays into design solutions, perhaps through building information modeling and other areas? Do you think there's a possibility, and perhaps we're not there yet, that artificial intelligence can be used to optimize solutions? Because there's a lot of trade-offs at the front end of construction, isn't there, between decarbonisation, capital cost, life cycle performance, etc. And these trade-offs are sometimes not that objectively assessed always, because the available data isn't there. So do you think AI can be used in that sense, Donna, as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we're dealing with now is not as much as the data is not there as the data is not shared. Kind of goes back to what I was speaking about a few moments ago. When we're in the design process, we have the data about those trade-offs, very extensive data that we look to analyze, the best design for the desired outcome. But then oftentimes that that fracturing, right, that occurs at the interface I spoke to, what happens is then you shift into the delivery mode, and it's all about optimizing for resource, cost and schedule, and we sometimes lose sight of some of the factors that were really driving the design solution. So, for example, it might not be the easiest and construction delivery for the best sustainable outcome, for example. And we start talking about being carbon neutral, net zero, and these long-term resiliency and sustainabilities in our infrastructure, there's just so much more that has to come into the equation. So I do think if we share information, if we use it through the continuum of that asset life cycle, then we'll get better results, for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And I was going to bring you in on this. Well, first of all, can I just remind everybody that we've got some questions coming through already, which is great. But can you just keep posting your questions, and we'll come to them in probably another 20 minutes or so. But Donna, for construction companies wanting to use big data analytics and AI to help reduce and manage risk, what do they need to know?
That data history, data history is a big challenge. For use of machine learning and other artificial intelligence techniques, they consume a lot of data. Think of Cookie Monster, if that's helpful. So as fast as the Cookie Monster can eat cookies, these machine learning and AI tools, they consume data, and the more data we have, the better we can train the machine. So inconsistency.
Somebody once told me it was like turning on a fire hose. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just as much as you can consume, the more you can train, but the inconsistency or unavailability of that history is a big challenge. So to realize the benefits. So I think what's important, the advice I could give in this space is to engage early, push for standards, and then coordinate the delivery across the life cycle. Because just because there's lots of data doesn't mean it's necessarily good data or accurate data. So the second piece of advice is centered around governance. So once you have the standards in place, you have to have processes in place to govern the quality of the data so that you can really rely on it for decision support.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Donna. Jerry, you wanted to say something there? Yeah.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, when I think of running a project on site, or looking at things from that construction company's point of view, the bottom line is, if I'm a contractor, I want to maximize profit while minimizing the cost. And sometimes with construction companies, they feel that, hey, if I can just do the bare minimum to get as much as profit as I can, that would be fantastic. But I think there's an opportunity there. If construction companies see the value of what's in it for me, if I have to collect all this data, what do I have to benefit? And I think if we start from there, with the education part of, actually there is a lot you start to benefit if if your crew is correctly populating daily reports, which is data rich. Daily reports are data rich. There's a lot of information in there. If we can even start from there, then I think we start to close the gap, because now they become, you start to have an understanding as to, okay, generally, it takes so much time to actually build something, as opposed to what you already have, in your what's already, what's indicated in your schedule. And I think that's a small step in trying to bridge the gap.
Excellent point, Jerry. Do you think there is a case for data being priced more by the industry in terms of, say, tender returns? Do you think has anybody tried to do that in the United States? I know that in the United Kingdom, some clients have talked about it. I don't know whether they're actually doing it, but do you think data needs to have a price on it on that? From anyone?
Alan, you're breaking up
You
there
were
again a
breaking
bit.
up there just a little bit, Alan, but I think, you know, I made reference to the fact that we internally talk about data as the new currency. So interesting juxtaposition of statements there. I do think there's a value there. I don't think we as an industry fully appreciate what that value is, because we still don't have enough case studies on the return on investment. I think that's a real struggle for the industry as well, is all this is moving so fast that the proof points aren't fully formulated yet. And without those proof points, it's really difficult to place a value on data, you know. And so right now we're very much as in, you know, value is in the eye of the beholder, and depending on how advanced you are as an organization and know how you can make the most of it, you know, you're basically, you know, just left with a big question mark.
Sure, no, that's a good point. Okay, we can move on, because there's another issue that I wanted to go to Jerry on in terms of how going back to the project phase, if you like. But before I do, I just wanted to mention that RICS has obviously produced global standards that are applicable in terms of standardization of data. And I just mentioned the International Construction Measurement Standards because they were put together by a collaborative coalition. And I think that aids benchmarking construction because it provides a common standard for comparison of construction costs between different markets. And then for RICS professionals, we followed that up with something called the Global Cost Prediction Professional Statement, which points to the use of ICMS, but also talks about the process of cost prediction, including signposting, of course, risk management, which we're talking about today. So I just wanted to outline that the RICS is heavily involved in this, trying to produce data standards that act at this profession technology interface, as we described at the beginning of this conversation. But Jerry, turning to you, what are some of the other ways that big data analytics and AI can be used to control risk, make projects run more smoothly, and obviously reduce the likelihood of disputes? Because I'm always aware of the statistic that the construction industry spends 15% of its output on disputes, would you believe? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, big data analytics and AI, you know, they really do have, you know, has the ability to identify and extract a lot of data. We've talked about that, you know, from different formats, you know, and they can be leveraged to manage risks, you know, and run projects more smoothly. So, for example, you know, AI can be proactively employed to, you know, automatically assess RFIs, you know, to understand which disciplines have, you know, the largest number of RFIs, you know, how long it takes to respond to RFIs, you know, whether response times actually meet the contractual obligations, you know, and which type of RFIs typically result, result in change orders. So having this type of information during the planning phase of a project will help, you know, project teams, you know, address challenges before they occur, or reduce the likelihood of change orders and disputes. You know, also, you know, even knowing this information on an active project will help the team take corrective measures, which, while construction work is, you know, is going on, you know. And then, you know, AI can be leveraged as well to mitigate unsafe job site practices, you know, by utilizing, you know, image recognition to assess video images. I mean, this can be a little bit controversial, you know, and then, you know, this information can then be used to tailor future training to address those recurring, you know, unsafe practices. And then if I could add on to this, which is near and dear to me, is, you know, daily reports. You know, AI can be used to extract and analyze the content of daily reports. When you think about daily reports, you know, the content that's in there, you know, you have, you know, work completed, weather conditions, Donna mentioned that, you know, materials delivered, you know, and used on site, you know, supply chain, you know, number of tradespeople on site, safety violations. So this information, you know, extracted from current and historical daily reports can really be used to anticipate and mitigate, for example, weather delays, shortages in labor and materials, as well as schedule delays, comparing the work that was planned versus actually what's happening on site.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jerry. And just to add to that too, I think the question, tying it back into actual risk, how do you actually do that, right? And some of the examples, we've been thinking about, or I think about, or when I'm driving down the road or whatever is you're right. We do have an enormous amount of isolated information, right, in various pieces and parts. But pull all that together, and then if we have a consistent, say if we pull all together, and then we pick an industry, say petrochem, right, and it's where I come from, so it's what I know. It's what I know best, right? And we see like this risk, whether it's a safety risk or a schedule or a risk that leads to a schedule delay or most likely a cost increase. Okay, so we see this happens at 72% of the time on all of these projects. So this is something now we have the data to build into the estimate and use that to prove that, to build in the estimate to do that mitigation and build that in part of the contingency, right? So that's just one way, but going back to, I think Donna, I like the other comment you made earlier about, the issue is not having data, is that it's where's it stored, and for a lot of construction companies, and it's been my experience, over the years that it's true, there is a lot of data out there, but it's not just that it's not shared, it's just in isolated areas. It might be sitting on a server someplace, or it might be sitting on a laptop in somebody's garage someplace it's no longer used, right? And everybody's got standalone Primavera licenses and all that schedule data, which would be phenomenal to pull together, that could really go through it and add to the greater whole. They would all have to be, brought in somehow. So there's an enormous exercise to go back and get that historical data, right? Both from a contractor standpoint, the owner standpoint, and then to go and make sense of it and to see if it's actually, data that can actually be used, right? Risk, it's truly garbage in, garbage out, like everything else. So, there's a bit of an uphill climb here to be able to get to the point where we can actually use this to better identify risk, better control it, and better in order to run projects a bit more smoothly, right? So.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Jerry. I mean, extending that concept, do you think in terms of post-occupation or the management of the asset, whether it's a building, infrastructure, or whatever, and do you think there's an increasing ability or need to actually use performance data and operational data to feed back into the design process to inform that in terms of data and analytics? Do you think that's also an issue here?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we've got to think about the whole life cycle and how it comes straight back around. So whether we are, designing a new bridge, what can we learn from, the similar bridge we built last year? Or if we're going in and rehabbing the bridge, before we do that, what can the bridge, quote unquote, tell us, right? We can have sensors on the bridge. Our infrastructure can talk to us now. What can it tell us about how it's performing? Dare I introduce the phrase digital twin, right? As that begins to mature in our market, and we have intelligent asset owners really, monitoring that data in an organized way, living, breathing assets that are helping us understand what's working, what's not working, and how can we continue to improve. When you think about how much sustainability and resiliency we could build into future infrastructure with what our infrastructure can just tell us about how it's performing today, it's kind of mind-blowing, I think.
That does beg a further question, though, doesn't it? In terms of there's a lot of disciplines involved in the construction process, and even further, more disciplines involved post-occupation. Engineers, facilities managers, architects, surveyors, etc. So how and all those professional bodies tend to have their own standards and their own classifications, if you like, of data. So how do we bring that together more in terms of collaborative solutions, do you think, in terms of data particularly? Donna, maybe that's a question for you. I'm not saying there are any easy answers, but I just wondered what your thoughts were about that issue.
There is no easy answers. I mean, I think it comes down to good old-fashioned talking to each other. Sharing, what's working for us, what's not working for us. I'll come back to those, those points of interface are really important. As an industry, we have to be willing to let our guard down and tackle those. Had a really interesting, I don't know if this resonates, but, had a really interesting discussion recently with someone about, information management. It's hard work, right? It's not 7-minute apps. That was the joke that they shared with me. It's hard work, and we have to appreciate that it's hard work. We have to roll up our sleeves and look at the points of interface, where the breakdowns are, where the fracturing is, where things aren't being shared, and we need to just tackle them. We need to prioritize them and tackle them one by one with just good old-fashioned talking to each other.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, I agree.
Well said. Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to echo Don, I mean, there is no easy answer. I mean, I think it's going to be each company doing their own thing, their own way, and taking care of their own data. So you're going to have some silos or pockets of massive amounts of databases within whatever company happens to be doing it the way they want to do it, with maybe bits and pieces of some communal knowledge that gets brought in, into the mix. But I think it's going to be it's a journey, right? It's going to take a long time, and it's going to, who knows, honestly, right? There's always, at the end of the day, it's all about the dollar. We know this, and if there is some financial benefit to sharing all this data without it being, if it's not sensitive data, then I think it would accelerate, right? So if there's a financial incentive, there's always a way to make things happen faster. But one other thing I was going to ask Donna about, just out of curiosity, we talk about going back in time and resurrecting all that data, right? But I mean, now other companies are doing it, and we're certainly doing it, is we're now collecting our data, with the end in mind, right? The end goal in mind. So we're shifting on how we actually hang on to stuff and keep stuff and everything. So with that, I mean, we're slowly building our, and other companies too are slowly building up their mass amounts of data. So how long do you think it would take? Is it an exponential kind of thing as far as growth to be able to have enough data to inform models and to use AI to its greatest extent? And I mean, that's just something I'm curious about. I've never been able to find anything on it, but we're starting from scratch.
I mean, I wish I had that crystal ball, right? When do we tip the scales? It goes back to the point about, use cases and proof points. I know we are continuing to, run experiments with algorithms we write, vendors we partner with in the industry. At the end of the day, and I think this is a really important point too, there's still human beings in the mix. Human beings have to, take decisions, and, the more information, the better the information is we can give them, the more informed the decisions can be. And I think, I think we'll know it when we know it. I know that's a really awful thing to say, but I think that, I think that there'll be I feel like there will be a tipping point where we're seeing the outcomes. We're seeing infrastructure that lasts longer because it was designed and constructed better. We'll see it come through in reduced OpEx expenditures. But I can't tell you the date. I wish I could. I'd play the lottery if I could do that.
It's coming soon. It's coming soon. So just before I turn to some, because we have got quite a few questions that are coming through. So just before I turn to ask the panel about some of and artificial intelligence in particular, I don't know who would like to kick off on that one. Jeff, do you want to give your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm gonna have to ask you to repeat yourself. It looked like you were broken up there again.
Do you want me to kick
sorry, but I can read it on. I can read it on this. I can read it on the screen here.
I'm sorry. I was asking about privacy and ethical considerations.
Oh, okay.
Oh yes.
Sorry. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff?
You know, it's a touchy subject, right? But it's something that we're going to have to handle or face head on, right? I mean, we're talking about privacy data from like IP data, and then we're talking about human privacy. And you know, Donna touched on a very touched on a good topic actually about the human factor and everything involved and the impact on human beings in general, and you know how humans are going to be, you know, yes, more involved and yes, always needed to be able to perform or to make the decisions based on technology. But you know, but sometimes I think, you know, we seem to forget about some of the other concerns too about individual privacy. Just very briefly, you know, I'll tell you a bit of a story about a job site that I was on about 15 years ago, and this is forward thinking at the time, but one of our clients was embedding their badges with RFID tracking chips, and just from a safety standpoint, to be able to track where everybody was in this particular site. And it did not go over well. It was sprung on the contractors. A lawsuit very quickly ensued. It was determined that it was a privacy concern, and then the whole initiative was scrapped, you know, shortly thereafter. So, you know, it's kind of a touchy ground we're going to have to go down, especially when we're talking about individual privacy. Right, you know, the things and some of the stuff that we're using now, that we're seeing using, and we're using the, you know, things like body cams and, you know, again, these tracking chips or drone technology that we're using to track progress and that type of thing. You know, yeah, there's a huge safety component of this. There's a huge productivity component to this, that you're able to see things in real time and be able to use that to feed AI to be able to update a schedule and update a forecast. You know, there's a ton of different benefits, but the trade-off is, how do these workers feel about being tracked every second of the day, right? And yeah, you're there to do a job, but I mean, where does the benefit stop? And the privacy concerns kick in. I mean, it's something that's going to have to be faced. I don't have any answers for it, or even thoughts in how we begin to go down that journey, but it's definitely something that needs to be faced.
I think one
No.
adjacent industry example that you maybe is a little further out in front, if we look at the kind of that whole space around connected and autonomous vehicles, right? This has been, you know, a big issue. You know, we have folks programming cars to drive that in some cases may not even have driver's licenses. You know, we have to build enough information into the tech to make decisions, and that fine line between the decision the machine makes on the behalf of the owner when it comes to safety. And I think there's some really good research and dialogue around this issue in that connected and autonomous vehicle space that's a few years out in front here as we talk about AI and in the construction management space. So that might be a place we look for inspiration and thought, leadership that could transcend like this, like the, you know, what's the modern version of the, you know, the kill switch. You know, at what point does the piece of equipment on the job site shut itself down because it's perceived a situation as being too dangerous? And where do we draw, you know, the line between, you know, taking that decision out of the operator's hands?
Sure. No, that's very interesting, Donna. And I think there's a perception also that AI might include the framework of the human who's setting the AI in the first place, which is and that human is of course subject to bias and a certain ethical framework anyway. So I suppose that comes into this as well. But I wanted to turn now to some of the questions that we've had submitted, because we've got perhaps 10 minutes left just to go through some of these, if I may. The first one is somebody points out that fragmentation is a big issue in the industry, and I think we've touched on that, and clients need to take control of the requirements. And the challenge there is a lack of experience and knowledge in these companies and areas to take the lead, the questioner's proposing, which brings in the whole issue of skills into the debate. I mean, we've certainly at the RICS considered things like data science and how it might impact the skills of construction professionals. What's the view of Faithful+Gould on this, Jeff?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, the data scientists are becoming a hot commodity, and it's in our view, it's somebody that it's a role that is increasingly important, that there should be at least one on staff. A lot of the construction companies that I have dealt with in the recent past, it's not something that they have the luxury of hiring, but absolutely, I mean, whoever posed the question is absolutely correct, right? We talked about fragmentation earlier, and companies are going to have to take the initiative to determine how they want to have this pulled together, right? And ideally clients. And if they drive it down, then contractors will follow, right? So if your owner puts in, makes a contractual requirement to make sure that there's data capture and data sharing, then all of a sudden, well, you'll see the contractor start hiring data scientists, that type of thing, right? So, again, but it needs to have the big question that they pose, right? Where do we start? How do we start? Where do we go, right? How do we do this? What's the right way to move forward, right?
Jeff, I think Alan brought up a good point earlier, which is like the role of the professional organizations, and ties into something I mentioned about the intelligent owner, and Jerry also mentions, that skills gap that she sees at the coalface delivery. So, I think there is an opportunity for more involvement of our professional bodies in awareness, education, research, thought leadership, to help drive the discussion about not just the type of skills, but then actually methods to acquire the right skills, so that we can, continue to close that gap.
Yeah, that's true. But some guidance around that. Okay, they can bring the skills in, but what do they do once they get them on board, right? What's the guidance around? How do we start, right? And I think that's important too to define.
Sure. No, that's again a excellent point. So I've got a question here, and I must confess the acronym, I'm not too sure what he or she means, but the question is basically, do you think the QSRA is still an effective tool in project management? I don't know if any of you knows what QSRA is, but I thought I'd ask it anyway. Jeff?
Yeah, qualitative quantitative schedule risk assessment, yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's very much alive, and I see it only becoming increasingly important as time goes on. And I see a great potential in having schedule data provide input into a risk model, not just a risk model, but also in, I hate to use the word predictive analytics, but that is one of the outputs of this, right? So, so yeah, it's still very much alive. I think there's a huge, relatively unexplored avenue, I think, in order to further use data to inform schedule risk models, right? And to punch that out to see how that affects. Yeah, so I'd be very interested in going down that rabbit hole offline here if anyone's interested. We have been doing some discussion internally around this. Yeah.
Well, Jeff's made an offer you can't refuse there, questioner. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jeff. But we also talked about standards, and I think it was Donna who referenced ISO 19650, which of course is an important standard. But one questioner has asked here, it made the point that it does not remove the quality issue we have in the data. Donna, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I do agree. Just because you have thoughtful information management doesn't mean you get the right information. So I think this is a space where, in addition to your information management standard, you also need to ensure you've got the quality management standards in place right beside them. Whether it's ACRA or what other process you're following, there needs to be a very thoughtful and standardized approach to quality assurance, quality control, and I think that you can't have one without the other if we're going to make the strides we've talked about in today's session. So really, really great point from the questioner. Very, very important point.
Okay, thanks, Donna. And another question that's come in here is that we haven't touched upon the commercial impact, I suppose, of digitization in the sense that This questioner is asking, don't you think the move to digital process will reduce costs, and thus a byproduct of this process is data and data analytics? I don't know what you think about that one, Jeff. Are Faithful and Gould seeing some benefits in terms of their digital strategy, or is that too early to say?
It's a little too early to say. I mean, we're heading that direction though as an industry, right? There will be some cost benefits that come out of this at the back end. And just talking not just risk, but if we're talking about project controls in general, obviously we see it becoming increasingly automated over time, which reduces the number of skilled labor to be able to do this. You're always going to need a human being to make sure that validate that stuff is real and relevant and accurate. But the more data we capture, the better data we capture, the more we can inform models, the more we can use this data to automatically update things like forecasts and reports, as Jerry mentioned earlier, and risk models and a slew of other things. And that does have a cost impact to it, not just from a labor standpoint, but also from the better data you get in, the earlier you can see that there's a problem on your project, the earlier you can make a decision that reduces the risk of a huge cost overrun. So there's the tangible, and then there's the intangible cost benefits that come out of this, I think.
This comment might be a little bit more from the designer's perspective, but we are definitely seeing quantifiable results for things like design reuse libraries, quantifiable efficiencies in the design delivery process there. And we're seeing then, to the last questioner's point on quality, the improved quality that comes out of thoughtful information management that's properly reviewed and controlled is resulting in less rework. So still counting and quantifying enough across the portfolio of projects, but clearly we're seeing opportunity for reduction in RFIs. And things like that as it moves into the construction process. And then the other specific example is on rehearsals. So digital rehearsals, whether you're looking at rehearsing a time sequence, or if you're doing a 5D rehearsal on cost, or maybe even a rehearsal on a maintenance task of some sort, when you can avoid having to redo something physically in the field by just doing a digital rehearsal, I mean, that's just money in the bank.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, we're coming towards the end of our session now. I think I think it's been very insightful. So thank you all. Thank you for your fantastic insight, Donna, and Jerry, and Jeff, and I would also like to thank Faithful and Gould for sponsoring this event. I'm sorry we had some problems with the sound, and particularly from me, but I hope you all heard the event, and the event will be recorded. We will publish a recording written summary of this webinar online, and please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Please take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. And I also wanted to mention the World Built Environment Forum Global Summit, which will be visiting Dubai as part of Expo 2020 in January 22. The program will focus on the livable, stable, smart, and healthy. To register your interest for this event and to find further details on the program, please visit the website rics.org/WBEF. And you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars and catch up on any you may have missed. And finally, you can download the WBEF app from the App Store or Google Play, where you access the latest innovative global thought leadership content across the built environment. So until next time, goodbye and stay well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.